documented by Lambert, she had taken to wearing Elizabeth Whitmore's clothes and jewelry. More disturbing were the reports that Adeline had begun to speak as if she were Mrs. Whitmore, giving orders a perfect imitation of the missing woman's voice and mannerisms. The other house slaves, apparently fearful, complied without question. In his private notes, Judge Lambert described interviewing a field slave named Moses, who had been caught attempting to flee the plantation in early November. Moses, before being returned to the Whitmore property, allegedly told Lambert, "There ain't no Whitmores no more. Miss Adeline says there never was." The judge noted that after Moses was returned to the plantation, the man was never seen again. His disappearance was explained away as a successful escape attempt, despite the doubled patrols that had been established following his first attempt. By December of 1848, a strange pattern had emerged. The Whitmore plantation continued to function. Business transactions occurred. Cotton was sold, supplies were purchased, yet the family remained absent. More troubling were the reports from the few tradespeople and merchants who visited the property. They described being greeted by Adeline Broussard, who now openly presented herself as Mrs. Whitmore. According to one account by a milliner who had come to deliver hats ordered months earlier by Elizabeth Whitmore, "The Negro woman received me in the parlor dressed in Mrs. Whitmore's clothing. She spoke with perfect diction and addressed me as if we had met many times before. When I inquired after Mrs. Whitmore, the woman looked at me strangely and said, 'I am Mrs. Whitmore.' What disturbed me most was not her claim, but rather how naturally she seemed to inhabit the role." Judge Lambert, increasingly troubled by the situation, attempted to organize a more thorough investigation in January 1849. His efforts were stymied at every turn. Local officials expressed reluctance to interfere with what they characterized as private plantation matters. Fellow judges advised him to let the matter rest. It was during this period that Lambert began to document what he described as a conspiracy of silence surrounding the Whitmore case. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, discovered after Lambert's death in 1852, he wrote, "Something has happened here that no one wishes to acknowledge. It is as if speaking of it might make it real, so they choose instead to look away and pretend." The most disturbing development came in February 1849, when a daguerreotype was taken at the Whitmore plantation during a gathering of neighboring plantation owners. The image, which surfaced in a private collection in 1931, shows what appears to be a formal dinner party. Seated at the head of the table is not Samuel Whitmore, but Adeline Broussard, dressed in fine clothes. More unsettling is the fact that none of the white guests seated around her seemed to find anything unusual about the arrangement. According to an analysis of the image conducted by Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University in 1934, the expressions on the faces of the dinner guests betray no discomfort or awareness that anything is amiss. They are engaged in conversation, smiling, raising glasses. The African-American woman in Elizabeth Whitmore's clothing is being treated as if she were, indeed, the lady of the house. By March 1849, Judge Lambert's inquiries had attracted unwanted attention. He reported receiving anonymous threats. His house was vandalized. In April, he was removed from the bench on charges of mental instability. Shortly thereafter, he relocated to New Orleans, taking with him his private records of the Whitmore investigation. The most comprehensive account of what may have happened to the Whitmore family comes from an unexpected source. In 1865, following the end of the Civil War, a former slave from the neighboring Bradford plantation named Isaiah Cooper provided testimony to a Union Army officer documenting conditions in the recently liberated territories. Cooper's account, preserved in military archives until 1948, describes events that occurred on the night of August 1st, 1848, 3 weeks before Richard Caldwell discovered the abandoned Whitmore carriage. According to Cooper, who claimed to have been present at the Whitmore plantation that night, it had been building for years. Master Whitmore, he had a particular cruelty about him, not the kind that leaves marks on the body, but the kind that breaks something inside. And Miss Adeline, she suffered more than most. Cooper described Adeline Broussard as having been purchased by Samuel Whitmore in 1842. She had previously been owned by a French family in New Orleans, was educated, and spoke both English and French fluently. Whitmore, according to Cooper's account, had purchased her specifically to serve as his wife's personal maid, but had other intentions. What Master Whitmore did to Miss Adeline over those years, it changed her, Cooper stated, not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There was a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore. The night of August 1st began, according to Cooper, with an elaborate dinner prepared by Adeline. The entire Whitmore family was present. By Cooper's account, nothing seemed unusual until after the meal, when the family began to display signs of distress. They was grabbing at their throats, their eyes bulging. Master Whitmore, he looked straight at Miss Adeline, like he finally understood something. And Miss Adeline, she just sat there watching them all, calm as still water. Cooper's testimony suggests that Adeline Broussard poisoned the entire Whitmore family at dinner that evening. What happened next, however, transitions from the disturbing to the nearly incomprehensible. Miss Adeline, she gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen. She told them, "The Whitmores have gone to visit family in Natchez. I will be managing the household in their absence." And then, this is what I still can't make sense of, everyone just nodded, like this was perfectly normal, like they hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Cooper described how Adeline methodically organized the disposal of the bodies, directing several trusted field slaves to bury the Whitmore family in the swampland at the far eastern edge of the property, an area rarely visited due to its unfavorable conditions. After that night, Cooper continued, it was like the Whitmores had never existed. Miss Adeline, she started wearing Mrs. Whitmore's clothes, sleeping in their bed. At first, just around the slaves, but then, when visitors would come, she'd receive them just like she was the lady of the house. The most disturbing element of Cooper's testimony was his description of how the neighboring plantation owners and Baton Rouge society responded to this extraordinary situation. The white folks, they'd come to dinner, sit at her table, converse with her like she was one of them. It wasn't that they were fooled. They knew who she was. It was like they chose not to see what was happening. Like it was easier to pretend. Cooper's account suggests a collective delusion, or perhaps a collective agreement, that allowed the white society of Baton Rouge to interact with Adeline Broussard as if she were Elizabeth Whitmore, rather than confront the horrifying alternative that an enslaved woman had murdered her owners and taken their place. Judge Lambert, in his final known writing on the subject before his death, perhaps best articulated the psychology at work. They cannot acknowledge what has happened without acknowledging what preceded it. And that, it seems, is the one thing they cannot bear to face. The historical record becomes increasingly fragmented after 1850. The Whitmore plantation continued to operate, apparently under Adeline Broussard's management, though all official documents bore Samuel Whitmore's signature. Business associates who had known Whitmore for years conducted transactions through Adeline, referring to her in correspondence as the representative of the Whitmore interests. In 1853, a fire destroyed most of the main house at the Whitmore plantation. No deaths were reported. The property was rebuilt on a more modest scale. Operations continued. The onset of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted cotton production throughout the South. Records from this period are scarce, but property tax documents indicate that the Whitmore plantation remained active, though at reduced capacity. Following the Union victory and the emancipation of slaves, the Whitmore property, like many Southern plantations, faced an uncertain future. What makes this case unique is that there was no white owner to either abandon the property or attempt to transition to a new labor model. According to local land records in 1866, the Whitmore plantation was formally transferred to a Mrs. Adelaide White, described in documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had handled the Whitmore accounts for decades. There is no further mention of Adeline Broussard in any official capacity after this point. Adelaide White appears in census records from 1870 as the owner of a modest but productive farm on what had once been Whitmore land. She is described as a widow with no children. The most unsettling postscript to this story comes from a series of interviews conducted in 1929 by folklorist Margaret Dunbar, who was collecting oral histories throughout Louisiana. Dunbar interviewed several elderly residents of East Baton Rouge Parish, including a 94-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor, who claimed to have been a house slave at a neighboring plantation during the Whitmore incident. Taylor's account largely corroborated Isaiah Cooper's testimony, but added one significant detail. According to Taylor, the conspiracy of silence surrounding the events at the Whitmore plantation extended far beyond simple fear or denial. It wasn't just that they pretended not to see, Taylor told Dunbar. Some of them, the wives especially, they understood. They'd sit with her, take tea with her, discuss household matters, all the while knowing exactly who she was and what she'd done. And in their eyes there was something like admiration. When asked to elaborate, Taylor reportedly said, "There were other wives who wished they could do what she did, not just to be free, but to make the ones who hurt them pay. They lived through her. That's why they protected her. That's why they saw her as Mrs. Whitmore, because in another world, maybe they could have done what she did." The final documented reference to the Whitmore case appears in a private letter written in 1936 by Edward Lambert, grandson of Judge Martin Lambert, to a colleague at Louisiana State University's History Department. In it, he declines a request to publish his grandfather's notes on the case. "Some stories once told cannot be untold," he wrote. "My grandfather spent the remainder of his life haunted not by what happened at the Whitmore plantation, but by what it revealed about the society in which he lived. Some truths are too terrible to acknowledge, and so we construct elaborate fictions to avoid them." The Whitmore case is not just a story about one family and one woman, but about an entire society's capacity for self-deception. Adelaide White died in 1882, according to parish records. She was buried in a small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Whitmore plantation. Her grave marker, documented in a 1954 survey of historical sites in the parish, bore only a name and 2 dates. In 1962, during construction of what would later become Interstate 10, workers excavating in the swampland that had once been part of the Whitmore property discovered human remains. According to the brief police report, 5 skeletons were recovered: 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals of indeterminate gender. The remains were estimated to have been buried for over 100 years. No further investigation was conducted. The remains were eventually reburied in an unmarked section of Highland Cemetery. The land that once constituted the Whitmore plantation has since been subdivided, developed, and incorporated into the expanding city of Baton Rouge. Nothing remains of the original structures. No historical markers commemorate the events that took place there. If not for the scattered documents, private journals, and oral histories that survived, the story of Samuel Whitmore and Adeline Broussard might have disappeared entirely. One more silence in a history filled with them. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but how an entire community could collectively agree to accept an impossible fiction rather than confront an unbearable truth. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying aspect of human nature is not what we do, but what we choose not to see. Today, if you drive along Interstate 10 just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Whitmore family was buried. Thousands traverse this route daily, unaware of what lies beneath. Like the society that once chose not to see Adeline Broussard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface, like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural, but entirely human. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, how many other Adeline Broussards have been erased from our history? How many other unbearable truths have we collectively agreed not to see? The final entry in Judge Lambert's journal, dated January 18th, 1852, just 3 months before his death, reads simply, "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." In 1965, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, attempted to publish a comprehensive study of the Whitmore case. Her research, drawing on many of the same sources cited here, was met with resistance from both academic institutions and local historical societies. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being indefinitely shelved. Not out of shame for the institution of slavery, which has been well documented and acknowledged, but because the Whitmore case represents something far more threatening, a complete inversion of the established order that was tacitly accepted by the very society it subverted. Perhaps most revealing was the response Pritchard received from the East Baton Rouge Historical Society when she requested access to any records they might have pertaining to the Whitmore family or their plantation. In correspondence with a colleague at Tulane University, Pritchard wrote, "There remains in certain circles an active desire to suppress this history." The Society's director replied with a brief note stating, "No such family is recorded in our archives." This deliberate erasure extends beyond mere historical oversight. As recently as 1958, when the remains of what was likely the original Whitmore Plantation House's foundation were uncovered during construction work, local newspapers reported the discovery as colonial-era ruins of unknown origin. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting the veracity of the Whitmore-Broussard case emerged in 1966, when renovations to the First Bank of Baton Rouge building uncovered a hidden compartment in what had once been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather portfolio containing bank transaction records dating from 1848 to 1853. These documents, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, but accessible only by special permission, include ledger entries for the Whitmore account signed in 2 distinctly different hands, both purporting to be Samuel Whitmore. Graphologists who later examined these signatures confirmed that the earlier ones match known examples of Samuel Whitmore's handwriting from before August 1848, while the later signatures appear to be skillful imitations. More telling are the subtle changes in the account's management after August 1848. Prior to this date, withdrawals were primarily for business expenses, with regular transfers to merchants in New Orleans and textile manufacturers in Massachusetts. After this date, while the plantation's operations continued, new patterns emerged. Smaller, regular withdrawals of cash, and most notably, the purchase of several medical texts and French language books from a New Orleans bookstore. In 1850, the account shows payment to a tutor from New Orleans, described in the ledger as providing educational services on the plantation twice weekly. This same year, there are records of payments to a dressmaker, a jeweler, and an importer of fine goods from France, expenses more consistent with the establishment of a new identity than the maintenance of an existing household. The bank records also reveal that in 1851, the Whitmore account funded the purchase of freedom papers for 3 individuals, described only as former property of neighboring estates. This remarkable transaction, a slave owner using plantation profits to free other planters' slaves, went apparently unremarked upon by bank officials. Perhaps most significant is a notation from November 1852 regarding the establishment of a separate account in the name of A. White, with an initial deposit transferred from the Whitmore holdings. This marks the beginning of the financial transition that would eventually lead to the formal transfer of property to Adelaide White in 1866. These financial records paint a picture not of a sudden violent rupture in the social order, but rather of a methodical, patient reconstruction of identity, one that required the complicity, or at least the willful blindness, of numerous officials, merchants, and community members over a period of years. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is, how was this possible? How could a slave woman not only murder her owners, but assume the social position of the plantation mistress, however imperfectly, without facing immediate discovery and punishment? Dr. Marcus Freeman, in his 1953 analysis, how was this possible? How could a slave woman not only murder her owners, but assume the social position of the plantation mistress, however imperfectly, without facing immediate discovery and punishment? Dr. Marcus Freeman, in his 1953 analysis of antebellum power structures, suggested that the very rigidity of the slave society paradoxically created the conditions for its subversion. The system was so predicated on absolute racial categories that when confronted with a situation that defied those categories, many simply could not process what they were seeing. We got a very special edition of the front porch today, y'all. Live from the front porch present. Thank y'all. Yeah. Treat it like a, treat it like a, we treat it like a, treat it like a, where we at? We treat it like a, treat it like a, live on the porch, gotta get the choice, yeah. Hey, they riding on the avenue, gotta keep it true. One more time, baby, y'all know what to do. Back you out for life, till they turn on my life.
These youngins be psyched, they doing it hype. They ain't doing it right, tell them put down them guns. Let's have some fun and do it for y'all. The ones that's gone, busting them heads, running for feds. You know what it is. Rock that grip, you know what they do. Background baby always come through. We laugh on the book with that few Gucci. One more time, she got to give me some Gucci. Ride again, ride for the fifth. One more time because they love that shit. This is for you and all of you and all the crew. We got to keep shit through. That's right. Yeah. Come on, come on, come on. Yeah. Yeah, extended version. Yeah. Come on. I heard it the bar. Say you got it going on. Yeah. Come on, let's go. My job, baby. We got you dripping wet. Hell yeah. The way we make you sweat. Give me come on, let's go. My job, baby. Southside. Live for the boys.